It was still dark outside when the diner lights flickered on. The small building sat alone on the side of the old highway, surrounded by tall pines and endless road. Inside, the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits filled the air as Clarice unlocked the front door and flipped the open sign. She had owned the place for nearly 10 years, and most mornings were the same, quiet, predictable, and peaceful. She liked it that way. The first hours of daylight were her favorite. The world outside was still sleepy, and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the soft crackle from the old radio sitting by the window. Clarice wiped down the counter with a towel, humming to herself, waiting for her first customer of the day. Usually it was a trucker passing through or an old man from town who wanted eggs and conversation. But this morning felt different. There was something strange in the air, a kind of heaviness like the sky was holding its breath. When she stepped outside to sweep the front porch, she noticed 2 police cars speeding past on the highway. Their sirens silent but lights flashing. They were going fast, dust rising behind them. Clarice paused for a moment, broom in hand, then shrugged and went back inside. Out here, police cars rushing down the road weren't uncommon. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that followed. A few minutes later, the bell above the diner door jingled softly. Clarice turned around expecting one of her regulars, but instead she saw a man she had never seen before. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to come in or not. He looked tired, his clothes dusty, his face bruised, and his jacket torn near the shoulder. His eyes were sharp, though, not wild, but cautious, like a man who had seen too much. "Morning," Clarice said gently, not wanting to startle him. "You can take a seat wherever you like." The man nodded and moved slowly toward a booth in the corner. He carried no bag, no helmet, nothing except the heavy leather jacket with patches stitched across the back. Clarice didn't look too closely, but one emblem caught her eye, the red and white symbol she recognized from the news. Hell's Angels. She'd never met one before, but she knew what people said. Most folks around here would have asked him to leave. But Clarice didn't move. She poured a cup of coffee, placed it on the counter, and brought it to his table. "You look like you could use this," she said with a small smile. The man hesitated, then nodded again. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the cup. He didn't meet her eyes. Clarice noticed his knuckles were scraped raw, like he'd been in a fight or an accident. She didn't ask questions. She just went back to the counter and gave him space. Outside, the sound of more sirens echoed faintly, coming closer this time. Clarice looked toward the window and saw 2 more police cruisers speeding down the road in the same direction as before. Her gut tightened. She turned back toward the man who was sitting rigidly now, eyes fixed on the window. He didn't move, but his whole body looked tense like a cornered animal. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. He didn't answer for a moment. Then he whispered, "They're looking for me." Clarice froze. "For you?" He nodded slowly. "But it's not what you think." He swallowed hard, his voice rough. "I didn't do anything, they don't believe me." Clarice didn't know what to say. She looked at him, really looked. The fear in his eyes didn't seem like guilt. It seemed like desperation. Something inside her, something quiet and instinctive, told her he was telling the truth. She'd been around long enough to read people. She could see when someone was lying. And this man wasn't. The sirens were louder now, the sound of tires crunching over gravel. 2 police cars pulled into the diner's parking lot, lights flashing red and blue through the front windows. The man stiffened. Clarice could almost hear his heartbeat from across the room. Without saying a word, she turned toward the kitchen door and gestured with her head. "Go," she whispered. He looked at her, uncertain. "You don't even know me." "Doesn't matter," she said quietly. "Go now." The back door. He hesitated for only a second before standing up and slipping through the kitchen. Clarice followed behind him and pointed to the storage room. "There's a door behind the crates. You can wait there till they're gone." He disappeared into the shadows, and Clarice returned to the front just as the officers entered. 2 men in uniform stepped inside. One tall and serious, the other younger with restless eyes. The tall one gave a polite nod. "Ma'am," he said, "we're looking for someone. White male, mid-40s, leather jacket. You see anyone like that come through here?" Clarice felt her heart beating in her ears. She forced herself to smile, wiping her hands on her apron. "Only folks I've seen this morning were some truckers about an hour ago," she said calmly. No bikers or anything like that. The younger officer scanned the diner, eyes narrowing toward the corner booth where the man had been sitting just minutes ago. "Mind if we look around?" he asked. Clarice's voice stayed steady. "You can look all you want. Just don't mess with my kitchen. I've got pies in the oven." The officers walked around for a minute or two, checking the bathroom and peeking toward the kitchen doorway, but they didn't go in. After finding nothing, they thanked her and left. The moment the door closed, Clarice let out the breath she'd been holding. She waited another 10 minutes just to be sure before heading to the back. When she opened the storage room door, the man was sitting on the floor, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He looked up at her, eyes wet. "They gone?" he asked. She nodded. "You're safe for now." He didn't move, just kept staring at her like he couldn't believe what had just happened. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "You could have gotten in trouble." Clarice leaned against the doorframe. "You looked like you needed help," she said. "That's all I saw." He blinked hard, his throat tight. "You don't even know what I am." "Maybe not," she said. "But I know what scared looks like." They stayed there for a while, not saying much. Clarice went back to cooking, and he stayed hidden. A few hours later, the sun climbed high, and the rush of police cars faded. She brought him some food, eggs, toast, and coffee. He ate quietly, murmuring thank you under his breath. When the road outside grew quiet again, he stood up to leave. "I'll be out of your way soon," he said. "Didn't mean to bring trouble here." Clarice wiped her hands on her apron again. "You didn't, just be careful out there." He looked at her one last time as if trying to memorize her face. "Nobody's ever done something like that for me before," he said softly. "You didn't even ask why." Clarice gave a small shrug. "Sometimes the reason don't matter." He walked out the back door, disappearing into the trees behind the diner. Clarice stood there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the open doorway. The morning quiet returned, but it didn't feel the same anymore. When she finally sat down to rest, she noticed his coffee cup still sitting on the table, half empty, growing cold. She picked it up and stared at the rim where his fingerprints still showed faintly. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to wash it. She set it on a shelf instead, next to the old radio, as if it belonged there. That night, the highway outside the diner was silent again, but Clarice couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's face, the exhaustion, the fear, the quiet gratitude. She wondered if he had made it far. She wondered if the police had found him. Mostly, she wondered why she had risked lying for someone she didn't know. But deep down, she knew the answer. She'd spent her whole life watching people judge others by what they looked like, what they wore, or where they came from. Maybe she was just tired of that. Maybe kindness, she thought, didn't need an explanation. When she finally drifted off to sleep, the sound of distant engines echoed faintly in her dreams, low, steady and far away, like thunder rolling over the hills. She didn't know that soon, those same engines would find their way back to her doorstep, bringing with them a day she'd never forget. The next morning came with soft rain tapping against the diner windows. The sky was gray and heavy, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the screen door. Clarice stood behind the counter, pouring coffee into the same old cup she always used. She hadn't slept much. Every time thunder rolled across the sky, she thought she heard motorcycles again, but it was only her imagination. The diner felt emptier than usual. A few regulars came in for breakfast, and she smiled like she always did, but her mind wasn't really there. She kept glancing toward the back door, half expecting the stranger to walk in again, but he didn't. By mid-morning, the highway outside was quiet. The sheriff's car drove past once, slow and watchful, but didn't stop. Clarice kept her head down, pretending not to notice. Inside, the radio played old country songs, soft and scratchy through the speakers. Everything looked normal, yet something deep inside her knew it wasn't over. When the rush of breakfast was done, Clarice sat by the window with a cup of coffee and stared at the road. She thought about the man, the fear in his eyes, the bruises on his face, the way he'd thanked her before disappearing. She didn't even know his real name. All she knew was that he'd been running from something he couldn't outrun. For years, Clarice had seen how people made quick judgments. She'd seen travelers turn their cars around when they realized a black woman owned the diner. Some smiled politely, others said nothing at all, but she had learned to live with it. She worked hard, minded her business, and treated everyone with kindness, even when kindness wasn't returned. But that morning, she began to wonder if maybe what she did the day before would come back to haunt her. If the police found out she had lied, they could close her diner or worse. Yet deep down she couldn't regret it. Something about that man had felt different. Broken, yes, but not cruel. As the rain grew heavier, a truck stopped outside. An older man stepped in, soaked from the storm. "You hear what happened down the road last night?" he asked while shaking off his jacket. Clarice tried to sound casual. "Can't say I did." "What happened?" "Police were chasing some biker," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Said he was one of them Hell's Angels. But the man got away. They've been searching the woods since sunrise." Clarice's hand tightened around the coffee pot. "Did they say why?" she asked. The man shrugged. "Some kind of misunderstanding, I guess. Word is he used to be part of the group, but not anymore. Don't know the full story. Folks just like to talk." Clarice nodded, forcing a small smile, though her mind was spinning. Used to be part of the group. That explained the way he talked, the sadness in his eyes. Maybe he really had left that world behind. After the man left, she stood alone behind the counter, staring out at the rain. Her reflection looked back at her in the glass, tired but steady. She thought about her late husband, who used to tell her, "Do good and let God handle the rest." Maybe that's what she had done. Maybe that's all she could do. By afternoon, the rain slowed, leaving the air cool and quiet. Clarice went outside to wipe down the tables beneath the diner's small porch roof. That's when she noticed something near the edge of the parking lot. A small patch of tire marks leading toward the woods. They were faint, already washing away. But she knew they hadn't been there yesterday. She stared at them for a long moment, then looked toward the trees. "I hope you're all right," she whispered softly. Inside, she returned to her routine. Lunch crowd, dishes, wiping counters, restocking shelves. The same rhythm she'd followed for years. But her thoughts never drifted far from the man she'd helped. That evening, as she was closing up, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering. "Highway Diner," she said. The voice on the other end was low and rough, familiar but cautious. "It's me," the man said quietly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Clarice froze, gripping the phone tighter. "Where are you?" "Far enough," he said. "I wanted to thank you again. You could have turned me in." She looked toward the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. "I just did what felt right," she said softly. "You found somewhere safe?" "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Some friends came through. They'll take me where I need to go. I just didn't want to leave without saying thank you. People don't usually help someone like me." Clarice smiled faintly. Maybe people just don't look close enough. There was a silence on the line, not awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. Then he said, "You ever need anything, you call this number." "I don't even know your name," Clarice said. He hesitated. "Ray," he said finally. "You can call me Ray." Then the line went dead. Clarice stood there for a long time, holding the phone, staring at the quiet diner. She didn't write the number down. Something told her she wouldn't need to. Days passed, and life settled back into its routine. The police stopped coming around, and customers returned. The whole town had moved on from the story of the escaped biker. But Clarice hadn't. She often caught herself glancing toward the empty booth in the corner, remembering how he had sat there, shaking hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. One afternoon, she noticed a small envelope under the diner door. No name, no address, just a folded piece of paper inside with a few words. "Thank you for your kindness. Some debts can't be repaid." Inside was a $100 bill. Clarice held the note for a long moment, smiling softly. She tucked it in the cash register but didn't spend it. It wasn't about the money. It was the meaning behind it, a quiet reminder that what she'd done had mattered. That night, she sat on her porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the headlights pass along the highway. The air smelled of pine and wet asphalt. She thought about how easily people crossed paths, strangers who might never meet again but could change each other's lives without even realizing it. A week later, she got a visit from the sheriff. He stopped by around closing time, his hat pulled low against the sun. "Evening, Clarice," he said, stepping inside. "Evening, Sheriff," she replied, wiping the counter. He looked around the diner before speaking again. "You see that biker they were after? Word is he's out of the state now. Guess he got lucky." Clarice met his eyes and smiled faintly. "I hope he did," she said. The sheriff studied her for a moment, maybe wondering if she knew more than she was saying. But he didn't press. He just nodded and tipped his hat. "You're a good woman, Clarice. Always were." When he left, she stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the highway. She exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. Later that night, after locking the doors, she walked through the quiet diner, turning off lights one by one. The last thing she did was glance toward that same corner booth. The seat was empty, but the memory wasn't. She thought again of the promise he'd made on the phone. "You ever need anything, you call this number." She hadn't called, and she didn't plan to. But the thought gave her comfort. Somewhere out there, a man she barely knew was alive because she'd listened to her heart instead of her fear. The following morning was bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows. Clarice brewed a fresh pot of coffee and opened the doors. The smell of bacon and biscuits filled the air, mixing with the sound of passing cars. Everything looked peaceful again. But as she wiped down the counter, a strange feeling came over her, like the calm before a storm. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense that something was about to happen, something big. And far down the highway, though she didn't know it yet, a line of motorcycles was starting to form. Engines rumbling, chrome glinting under the rising sun. They were heading her way. Clarice poured herself another cup of coffee, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The morning sun rose bright and gold over the highway. The air felt fresh after days of rain, and the smell of damp pine drifted through the diner's open windows. Clarice moved quietly between the tables, setting down salt shakers and refilling sugar jars. It was just another day, or at least it looked that way. The radio played soft jazz, and the hum of her old ceiling fan mixed with the low whistle of wind outside. She had no idea what was coming. Around 7, the first customer arrived, a delivery driver she'd seen before. He greeted her kindly, ordered eggs and toast, and talked about the weather. Clarice smiled and listened, though her mind was somewhere else. She kept thinking about the phone call from that man, Ray. It had been a week now, and she still caught herself replaying his words. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe it was because for a few moments, she'd been part of someone's turning point, a small act of trust between two strangers who should have had every reason to fear each other. When the driver left, she stepped outside to stretch her legs. The road stretched far in both directions, shimmering under the sun. It looked peaceful, but she could feel something strange in the air, a faint vibration in the ground so subtle she almost missed it. She brushed it off and went back inside. By 9 o'clock, she noticed it again, a low hum, growing louder, steady and rhythmic like distant thunder. The windows trembled slightly. Clarice turned off the radio, frowning. Then she heard it clearly, the deep growl of motorcycle engines. Not one or two, but dozens. Maybe more. She stepped to the door, shading her eyes from the sun. Down the highway, a dark line appeared on the horizon, a wave of movement, glinting metal and black leather. The sound grew until it filled the air. Her heart skipped. It wasn't just a few bikes. It was hundreds. She stood frozen as the first group turned into her parking lot. Then another and another until the entire place seemed swallowed by motorcycles. The engines rumbled like a living heartbeat, shaking the ground. Locals driving by slowed down, staring in disbelief. The quiet diner suddenly looked like the center of something far bigger. Clarice's first thought was that the police were after them again, that somehow she had been caught in the middle. Her second thought was simple fear. She didn't lock the doors, but she thought about it. Then one man stepped forward from the crowd. He took off his helmet, and even before she saw his face, she knew. It was him, Ray. He looked different now. The bruises were gone, his clothes were clean, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. The leather jacket he wore wasn't torn anymore, but patched and polished. He smiled when he saw her, a real smile that softened the hard lines of his face. Clarice opened the door, still unsure what to say. "You," she breathed. "What in the world is this?" Ray walked up to the porch, rain-streaked boots thudding against the wood. "You remember when I said I owed you?" He said. "Well, I pay my debts." Before she could reply, he turned and gestured toward the riders behind him. "Brothers," he called out, his voice carrying over the engines. "This is the woman I told you about." 200 men and women, all in black leather, nodded in respect. Some raised their helmets. Others simply stood silent, waiting. Clarice blinked in disbelief. "I told them how you helped me," Ray continued. How you could have turned me in, but you didn't. You listened instead of judging. And I told them we don't forget people like that. Clarice looked from him to the crowd of bikers. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. You didn't have to do all this, she said softly. Ray chuckled. Ma'am, if I didn't, I'd never hear the end of it from them. The riders laughed lightly, the tension breaking. One by one, they began parking their bikes, removing helmets, and heading toward the diner. Clarice stepped aside, still dazed. Within minutes, every seat was full. The small place that usually felt quiet and empty was alive with chatter and laughter. Clarice hurried behind the counter, unsure where to start. You all hungry? She asked. A roar of laughter answered her. Starving, one of them shouted. So she did what she did best. She cooked. Bacon sizzled, coffee brewed nonstop, pancakes stacked high. A few of the bikers even helped her, passing plates and refilling cups. She moved fast, her nerves giving way to something else. Energy, purpose, the thrill of the unexpected. For a while, the diner felt like a different world. The bikers weren't loud or rude like she had feared. They said ma'am and thank you and joked kindly with her. One of them, a gray-bearded man with soft eyes, told her he'd been riding for 40 years and never seen anyone brave enough to stand up for one of them before. Most folks just see the jackets, he said, taking a sip of coffee. They don't see the people wearing them. Clarice nodded quietly. Maybe people just forget to look deeper, he smiled. You didn't. By midday, the diner had run out of half its supplies. The bikers didn't mind. They just ordered whatever was left. Some paid double, some left cash tips on the counter. One woman slipped a folded bill into Clarice's hand and said, For your kindness. Clarice didn't even look at the amount. She just smiled and said, Thank you. Outside, the highway shimmered with heat. Locals who drove by slowed down, their eyes wide at the sight of hundreds of motorcycles lined up like soldiers. The sheriff's truck passed once, slowed, then kept going when he saw there was no trouble. Inside, laughter echoed through the diner walls. Someone played music from a small speaker, and a few bikers clapped along. It wasn't chaos, it was joy. For the first time in a long time, Clarice's diner wasn't just a stop along the road. It was a place alive with stories, laughter, and gratitude. When the rush finally slowed, Ray came to the counter. He looked around at his friends eating, smiling, and said quietly, You didn't have to trust me that day. I don't forget that kind of thing. Clarice wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him. You said you were trying to leave that world behind, she said softly. He nodded. Still am. I used to think I didn't have anyone who'd believe I could change. You proved me wrong. Clarice felt something tighten in her chest, that quiet warmth that comes when kindness finds its way back to you. She looked at him with a gentle smile. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, she said. Ray reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in a small cloth. He set it on the counter and unfolded it. Inside was a leather patch, the same symbol she'd seen on his jacket the first day they met. But this one was different. Instead of the usual club markings, it had words stitched carefully in white thread. Guardian of the road. This is for you, he said. A reminder that what you did mattered. Clarice stared at it, speechless. The patch was simple, but it carried weight, not as a decoration, but as a symbol of respect. She tried to hand it back. I can't take this, Ray smiled. You already did. You earned it. By afternoon, the riders began leaving one by one, engines roaring to life again. Each one waved as they passed. Some called out goodbyes. Others simply nodded. The sound filled the air until it slowly faded down the highway. When the last bike disappeared into the distance, the diner felt strangely quiet again. Clarice stood outside on the porch, the patch still in her hand. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few crumbs of gravel kicked up by tires. She walked back inside, looking at the tables, empty cups, crumpled napkins, laughter still lingering like a soft echo. She had never seen anything like it, and she knew she never would again. She cleaned slowly, still smiling to herself. The day had been wild and exhausting, but it had filled something inside her that she didn't even know was empty. That evening, when the sun began to set, she hung the leather patch on the wall behind the counter, right above the coffee maker. The golden light from the window caught its white stitches, making them glow softly. She stood there for a while, watching the light fade. For years she had worked quietly, never asking for attention or praise. But that single act of kindness, a moment of instinct had rippled farther than she could ever imagine. As she locked the doors for the night, the silence felt peaceful, not lonely. She turned off the lights and paused one last time at the window. The sky was turning pink and purple, and in the distance, just barely, she thought she heard the faint growl of engines again. She smiled. "Ride safe," she whispered. Then she turned away, the glow from the patch still shining behind her, and for the first time in a long while, Clarice felt that maybe the world was still capable of surprising her, in the best possible way. It was early the next morning when Clarice unlocked the door to her small diner. The air was cold and the sky carried the soft gray of dawn. The neon sign above the door flickered to life, humming quietly as she turned on the lights inside. The smell of coffee filled the room, familiar and comforting. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another quiet morning. But something about the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the world was holding its breath. Clarice moved through her usual routine, wiping the counter, setting the napkins and preparing the breakfast menu. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind kept going back to the man she helped the day before. Ray. She didn't know if that was his real name or not, but it didn't matter. What she remembered most wasn't his name. It was the look in his eyes before he left. It wasn't anger or fear. It was gratitude mixed with something deeper, something like disbelief that someone had actually stood up for him. She shook her head and tried to push the thought away. The night before had already felt like a dream. Maybe she'd never see him again, and maybe that was for the best. Her life was simple, and she liked it that way. She didn't want any trouble. Still, every time a motorcycle engine echoed faintly in the distance, she felt her heart skip a beat. By 8 o'clock, a few regulars had come in. Old Mr. Tucker sat in his usual booth, reading the newspaper and pretending not to notice everything around him. 2 truckers ordered pancakes and a young couple shared coffee near the window. Everything looked normal again, calm, peaceful. Clarice moved between tables, smiling softly, her apron already dusted with flour. But then, something strange happened. A low rumble started somewhere far away. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint vibration in the floor. The kind of sound you don't notice until it grows stronger. At first she thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The rumble grew louder, steadier, and then it came again, closer this time. The windows began to tremble lightly. The young couple by the window looked outside. "What's that?" the woman asked, standing up slightly. Clarice walked over and peered through the glass. At first, all she saw was empty roads stretching into the horizon. Then she saw them, small dark shapes moving in the distance. 1, 2, 5, then 10, and they were getting bigger. Clarice blinked. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Maybe more. The sound grew until the whole diner seemed to vibrate with it. The regulars turned their heads, murmuring to one another. One of the truckers even stood up and went to the window. "That's a whole pack," he muttered. "Where are they headed?" Clarice didn't answer. Her hands rested on the counter, her stomach tight. She didn't know why, but her first thought was him, the man she had helped. Could it be connected somehow? It didn't make sense. She tried to tell herself it was just a group passing through, maybe a ride or a charity event. But then the first group of bikers turned off the main road and began pulling into her parking lot. Engines roared and tires crunched against gravel. The entire building seemed to shake. There weren't 10 or even 50 of them. There were hundreds. Men and women in leather jackets, some with patches and some without. They parked in long, perfect rows, one after another, until the lot outside her diner looked like a sea of chrome and black metal. The regulars inside went silent. A few of them stood up, unsure what to do. Clarice froze by the counter. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. For a second, she thought they had come looking for trouble. Maybe the police had found out she'd helped Ray, and these bikers had come to scare her into silence. Her breath caught in her throat. She almost reached for the phone to call someone, but then the door opened. A tall man stepped in first. He had a calm face, dark hair tied back, and a leather jacket with a worn-out emblem on the back. Behind him, a few others followed, but they stopped at the door, waiting. The tall man looked around the diner, then at Clarice. His eyes softened. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a deep but gentle voice. Clarice swallowed. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound steady. He smiled slightly. I think we're the ones who came to help you." He stepped aside, and from behind him walked Ray, clean-shaven, neat, and looking like a different man entirely. His bruises were fading, and his shoulders no longer slumped. He looked proud. When he saw Clarice, his face broke into a wide smile. "Morning, Miss Clarice," he said, his voice warm with emotion. "Told you I'd see you again." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she let out a shaky laugh, the tension melting from her body. "What on earth is going on?" she asked, looking from him to the crowd outside. Ray turned and gestured toward the hundreds of bikes lined up in her parking lot. "They're my brothers," he said simply. "Word got around about what you did yesterday. How you stood up for me when nobody else would. How you could have turned me in but didn't. They wanted to meet the woman who showed that kind of heart." Clarice blinked, speechless. The regulars stared in disbelief. "All of them?" she asked quietly. "All of them," Ray said with a smile. "We ride together and we don't forget kindness. Not ever." More bikers started coming in. Not all at once, but a few at a time. They were polite, careful, and surprisingly quiet. Some tipped their helmets at her, others just smiled. The diner filled up quickly. Every booth and counter seat taken. Outside, more waited patiently, talking and laughing among themselves. The sound of engines mixed with laughter and conversation. Clarice moved slowly behind the counter, trying to take it all in. Her little diner had never been this full. She looked out at the sea of leather jackets, tattoos, and rough faces. But what she saw wasn't danger. It was gratitude. These people weren't here to cause trouble. They were here to honor something simple, a small act of kindness. Ray walked to the counter and placed a thick envelope on it. "For your trouble," he said softly. "For the food. For the time. For being brave." Clarice shook her head. "I can't take that," but Ray just smiled. "You already gave more than money can buy," he said. "Let us give something back." Before she could argue, he turned to the room and raised his hand. "Eat up, brothers," he called. "Today we support family." The whole diner cheered. The atmosphere turned bright and warm. The tension that once filled the room vanished completely. The regulars began to relax too. Even old Mr. Tucker cracked a smile and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Clarice and her small team worked non-stop, serving food, pouring coffee, and taking orders. The bikers were generous, leaving big tips, helping clean up, even carrying supplies from the back. They didn't act like outlaws. They acted like a family that had just found a new home for the day. Hours passed like minutes. Outside, locals began to gather, curious about the noise and crowd. But there was no trouble. Just laughter, music from portable speakers, and people shaking hands. One of the bikers even helped a little boy climb onto his motorcycle for a picture. It looked more like a festival than anything else. Around noon, Ray came back to the counter. Clarice was tired, but her eyes sparkled. "You've got quite a family," she said. He nodded. "And now so do you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black leather vest, cleaner than the rest, simple, with one patch sewn on the back. It read, "Guardian of the Road." He placed it gently on the counter. "This is for you," he said. "Because you didn't just help me. You reminded all of us that there's still good out there. You stood up for someone you didn't even know. That means something to us." Clarice stared at the vest, her eyes wet. She didn't know what to say. She just nodded slowly, smiling through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I only did what anyone should do." Ray looked at her, his voice calm. "Maybe, but not everyone does." When the afternoon sun began to fade, the bikers started leaving one by one. Engines roared to life again, the sound echoing down the highway. Some waved as they rode off. Others just nodded respectfully toward her. Within an hour, the parking lot was empty again, except for the faint smell of gasoline and the marks of tires on the gravel. Clarice stood at the doorway, holding the leather vest close to her chest. The diner was quiet again, but her heart was full. What had started as a normal day had turned into something she'd never forget. And as the last engine faded into the distance, she whispered to herself, "Maybe kindness really does travel farther than I thought." The next morning, the town still buzzed with stories about what had happened at Clarice's diner. The sound of hundreds of motorcycles had echoed for miles, and everyone within earshot had seen or heard something. By sunrise, people were already talking about it in grocery stores, barbershops, and on social media. Some said they'd seen the crowd themselves. Others said they didn't believe it at all, until pictures started showing up online. Someone had taken a photo of Clarice standing in front of her diner, surrounded by a sea of motorcycles. The picture had gone viral overnight. It looked almost unreal. The small-town diner, the woman in her apron, and the rows of bikers who looked more like bodyguards than customers. The caption under the photo read, "This woman stood up for one of us. We'll never forget." Clarice had no idea any of this was happening. She came to work as usual, expecting a quiet day after the chaos. When she parked her car outside, the first thing she noticed was that someone had cleaned up the parking lot. All the tire marks, the cups, and even the trash from the day before were gone. It looked spotless, as if no crowd had ever been there. But when she went to unlock the door, she saw something taped to the glass. It was a note written in careful handwriting. It said, "Thank you for reminding us what kindness looks like. Ride safe, live free. The Angels." Clarice smiled softly as she read it. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She didn't think much more about it until the breakfast rush began, but that morning the customers weren't her usual faces. There were people she'd never seen before, strangers from nearby towns, families, and even a few travelers passing through. Some said they had come because they'd seen the post online. Others said they had heard about the biker woman on the radio. They all wanted to see the place where it happened. They took photos, ordered coffee, and told Clarice how inspired they felt by what she did. At first, she didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to attention. She just smiled, thanked them for coming, and kept working. But as the day went on, it became clear that this was something bigger than she expected. By noon, the diner was packed again, not with bikers this time, but with people wanting to be part of the story. Her cook, a quiet man named Lyle, leaned over the counter and whispered, "You know you're famous now, right?" Clarice chuckled. "Famous, me? Don't be ridiculous." "I'm serious," he said, holding up his phone. "You're all over the internet. Somebody made a post about what you did. It's got thousands of shares." Clarice frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Shares of what?" Lyle showed her the screen. There it was, her diner's photo, her face in the middle of all those bikers. Dozens of comments poured in beneath it. Some called her brave. Others said she had more heart than most people these days. A few said they planned to visit her diner just to meet her. She stared at the screen in disbelief. "This can't be real," she whispered. But it was. The world outside her little town had seen something in her act, something rare and human, and they were moved by it. By the next day, reporters started calling. Local news stations wanted to do interviews. Radio hosts asked her to come on air. One journalist even showed up at the diner unannounced, camera crew in tow, smiling and asking if she'd share her story. At first, Clarice wanted to say no. She wasn't a hero. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, not in her eyes. She had simply helped someone who needed it. But when she saw how genuinely curious people were, she agreed to speak once, just once, to tell the truth. The reporter set up a small camera in the corner booth. Clarice sat opposite her, her hands folded on the table. The reporter smiled warmly. "So, Miss Clarice, can you tell us what made you help that man, even when you knew he might be in trouble?" Clarice thought for a long moment before answering. "I didn't see a criminal," she said softly. "I saw a man who looked scared, tired, and hungry. He looked like he hadn't had a good day in a long time. Sometimes people don't need questions and they just need a chance to sit down and breathe. That's all I did." The reporter smiled, clearly touched. "And what was it like when those bikers showed up?" Clarice laughed quietly. "Terrifying," she admitted. "At first, I thought they were coming for me. But then I realized they were there to say thank you. It was the most surprising, humbling thing I've ever seen." The interview aired that same night. Within hours, messages began pouring into the diner's social media page. People from different cities and even other countries writing to tell her how her story gave them hope. Some said they had been scared to trust strangers before, but her act reminded them that kindness still mattered. By the end of the week, her little diner was busier than it had ever been in all her years of running it. The parking lot that once stood half empty now overflowed with cars, trucks, and motorcycles. Tourists stopped by on road trips. Locals brought their families for dinner, and every table carried a small conversation about the woman who helped the biker. Clarice felt grateful, but part of her also missed the quiet. She never wanted fame. What she wanted was to keep doing what she always did: serve food, listen to people, and offer warmth in a world that often felt cold. One evening, after closing, she sat by the counter with a cup of coffee, staring at the leather vest hanging on the wall, the one Ray had given her. "Guardian of the Road," the patch read. The words glowed faintly under the soft light. She smiled at it, remembering his voice, his quiet gratitude, and the sound of hundreds of engines roaring away into the distance. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. She turned to see a young man outside holding a small package. She opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you, son?" He nodded shyly. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. I just wanted to drop this off. It's from my uncle. He said you'd know what it means." She frowned, taking the package carefully. The boy waved and left before she could ask more. Inside the diner, she opened it slowly. There was a small wooden box, hand-carved, and inside it lay a silver keychain, shaped like a winged wheel, the same symbol she'd seen on the bikers' jackets. Beneath it was a note written in the same handwriting as before: "For the woman who reminded us that even those who walk rough roads still need a place to rest. You'll always have a seat at our table. Ray." Clarice smiled through tears. She placed the keychain next to the register where everyone could see it. It wasn't about pride. It was a reminder that sometimes one small act could ripple farther than anyone expected. In the following days, she noticed something beautiful happening in the diner. People started showing more kindness to one another. Strangers helped strangers. Someone paid for another's meal quietly. A group of travelers left a thank you note for her under a coffee cup. It felt as if the spirit of that day still lived inside the walls of her little place. Even the sheriff, who had once looked suspicious when he came asking about the biker, stopped by one afternoon. He leaned on the counter and said, "Heard you had quite the crowd last week." Clarice smiled. "You could say that." He nodded. "You did good, Clarice. Not everyone would have done what you did, but you made this town proud." When he left, she stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The noise, the kindness, the sudden fame. It was all too much and yet so strangely beautiful. That night, when the lights were off and the diner stood silent, Clarice looked out the window at the empty road. The moon shone over the asphalt, and in the distance, she thought she heard a faint echo of engines once more. Not loud, but steady, like a promise. It made her smile. She whispered to herself, "Wherever you are, ride safe." And as she closed her eyes, she realized something that made her heart warm. Sometimes kindness doesn't just change one person's life. Sometimes it lights a spark in a whole town.